After 20 years of platform building and resets, Arrowhead is making a bid to become a large-cap biotech. And Synnovation shareholders are reaping a windfall from a $2 billion deal with Novartis. We'll discuss both topics on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Plus, we take a look at where AI is integrating into the biotech venture funnel and bring you the latest on MFN and the search for a new CBER director at FDA. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast, and joining me today are my colleagues
Simon Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Lindsay Martin, Biopharma Analyst.
And Steve Usden, Washington Editor.
All right, Lindsay, welcome to the pod. It's good to have you making your debut.
Thanks, Jeff. Excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, we'll get to your bit. Lindsay had a very nice story on AI and venture. We'll talk about that in the second segment. But first, BioEquity Europe, our longest running conference now in its 26th year. The meeting always sells out, so you'll want to get a move on. It's coming up in May. And for the first time, we're going to Prague. So you'll want to make sure you sign up before prices increase April 1st. Simone, you'll be there. I know you're bringing Stephen along.
I'm super excited. I do want to say for anybody who's sitting around waiting, do not sit around and wait. Register now because we do sell out, and in particular, presenting companies. So what we hear year after year is that companies go, they get a really good range of investors attending, European investors, some US investors, really high quality ones. It's a very, very focused meeting. It's not a trade show at all. So that is the reason actually we keep the numbers quite small. And then there's a lot of networking events. So as a presenting company, you get certain benefits, but in addition to the room where you present, there are networking opportunities. And, you know, Jeff, it's always on that bus to here or like that little facial over there or whatever it is that Brian has cooked up. Yep. And we have an extra exciting thing this year in that our colleague Steve Usden is going to be there. He is joining us at BioEquity. I think that's been a little while. And he's going to be interviewing Richard Pazder, I believe, and a very compelling session that's going to be. So many reasons to go, if not to Steve Usden in the flesh.
Well, I don't know about me, but Rick Pazder is going to have interesting things to say. And I think, you know, he's particularly charged up and interested in Central Europe. He's spent a lot of time helping companies and government in Poland with their oncology regulatory system. And he's got a lot of enthusiasm for this. And I think that's the thing that really interests me about this meeting in particular is this idea of kind of expanding our reach and our knowledge and helping to make connections in Central Europe, because I think that's one of the kind of untapped regions of innovation, of clinical innovation, of research. And that's going to be really interesting.
And a last point, because you said that crucial word, clinical, Steve. A big theme of the conference is the speed to the clinic. And we will be doing some data analysis on that in our scene setter. And that's a really hot topic. So that's a thread that's going to run through. And I am sure you're going to be talking with Dr. Pazder about that as well, Steve.
Excellent. Well, what are we looking for presenting companies? Private European companies. We are looking for you. Early stage, new to the stage. Investors always love getting to hear the new voices out there. Seed, Series A, Series B. Drop me a line. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at my BioCentury email address, or go to bioequityeurope.com and you can click on the link there. We've just wrapped. Yep.
Josh always says that people who presenting companies have a much higher hit rate for getting partnering meetings as well. This is a rumor that I hear, but I bet it's true.
That is true. And I'm hearing a lot of rumors about delicious Czech beer. Perhaps those aren't even rumors. That's just delicious.
I can confirm. I can confirm.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Stephen will be right there to confirm with you, as well as looking for his next story. So don't miss out on connecting with all of the BioCentury crew at the meeting. We're just back from Korea, and we've talked a lot about Korea lately. I just wanted to drop in that we have a deep dive deck that we released to participants at the meeting. It's available on biocentury.com, along with a perspective on the state of Korean biotech by Simone. So look out for those. All right, let's dig into it. Stephen, Arrowhead. It's been a long road, really long. I feel like they've been through several incarnations, and here we are. They really feel like they've got some momentum. You did a deep dive. We released it last week. What did you learn?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. No, you're right. And I think this is one of the stories I do find, aspects of these stories I find really interesting. It's just about the history of these companies and how they evolved to get to where they are. I'll try and keep the history bit to a minimum here, but just to give you an example. So in Arrowhead's case, they launched in 2003 and they were a nanotech company. And this meant that they were essentially like an umbrella organization that was funding research at various US universities into all sorts of bits, like really small optical sensors or tiny little batteries that, I don't know, maybe that you would use for like a mouse-sized EV or something like that. But they were doing all this, funding all this research in really disparate industries. And they did it for about 4 years. Nothing really was making too much progress. But they had, as one of these sort of funding projects, they had brought in some IP from Caltech, and it was looking at RNAi. And when the current chairman, president, and CEO, Christopher Anzalone, was asked whether he would join the company in 2007, he took a look at these companies, at these subsidiaries, and was like, I don't know why you've built the company this way, but it doesn't make any sense. He was like, but I will come in on one condition. If we focus this company on the RNAi stuff and just basically get rid of everything else. And so they agreed, and that's kind of where they went. Now, it wasn't a straight up from there. The platform they had didn't really work that great. It was working with naked siRNA, and if people recall, the late 2000s, early 2010s, companies were still trying to figure out how do you deliver siRNA in a way that delivers efficacy and does it in a safe way. And there was still a lot to be worked out there. But it was interesting that this kind of then got them started on the road towards the company they are now. Now, along the way, they acquired some assets from Roche, from Novartis. Again, this was a period where pharma had really no belief in RNAi as a therapeutic modality. So they, I think for them, he said they got them on the cheap. But even then, that still wasn't sort of getting Arrowhead to where it needed to be. They had IV delivered siRNAs that still were having potential, we're still kind of wrangling with the safety. Dosing wasn't really optimized. So it was kind of still sort of suboptimal from where they wanted to be. And so the big turning point came in 2016 when they actually had a safety signal pop up in a non-human primate study. So they hadn't seen anything in the clinic. They had 3 programs in the clinic. They hadn't seen any problems there, but it came up in this preclinical study. And the company had to make a decision. Do we spend money trying to figure out whether this is a real signal or not? Or do we try to move on to something that we think could be better? And I think it was a tough call to make, but in the end, I think it proved to be the right call. Basically, they scrapped they were in phase 2B at the time. They scrapped all their clinical programs and shifted to what they call the TRIM platform, which is a subcutaneously delivered, sort of new, more simplified, basically more modern version of siRNA. So they went from being a phase 2B to being a preclinical company, which obviously investors killed them for. But in the end, I think that proved to be the right one, because now the pipeline that they have today is really built entirely around this TRIM platform.
Stephen, thanks. That's a very good context for how they got to where they are. Now, we have pegged Arrowhead as a company to watch.
Yep.
I believe it was one of our Super 17.
I believe that's
back
right.
In 2023, when we did Back to School, which means we think they are potential tier jumper. talk about their market cap now, why we think this company is worth watching, and sure. And why investors are getting excited about it.
Right. So where they've gotten now, their market cap right now is just shy of $8 billion. So they're a good size already. But the reason I think investors are really excited about them is because they are literally in the first quarter of their first commercial launch. Their drug was first approved in November of last year. The drug is plozisiran. It was first approved for a very rare setting, so FCS, where there's, thought to be maybe a couple thousand patients, maybe a little bit more. But the real, I think, exciting thing and the real opportunity here is, so this is a drug that targets APOC3. So it's targeted at reducing triglycerides. And the big opportunity is in the severe hypertriglyceridemia market. That is where they're already in phase 3 and they have data reading out in the third quarter. And that is not a small market. That is potentially 3 million patients. And so while the FCS opportunity is sort of the way into the market, I think what people are really looking at is, can you expand this into a broader and broader patient population with triglyceridemia? And then that really gets, talking about a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for this drug. And there's another drug on the market already for FCS. It's Ionis's Tryngolza, which also targets APOC3. But when you look at the data comparison, at least in the FCS population, Arrowhead looks like it has better efficacy. There isn't any platelet reduction sort of issue. They have 3-month dosing, so quarterly dosing versus 1-month dosing. So on the surface, it looks like they have a pretty positive profile for this drug. And so I would expect to see a pretty good launch here. And then if you can start expanding that out, that looks even better.
So a couple of things there. First of all, people don't know how many takes it took Stephen to get the name of the drug.
4. I think it was just 4.
Given that, he went straight to FCS without calling it familial chylomicronemia syndrome. Right?
I wasn't going to touch that after that.
Well done.
That was good.
There you go.
It was almost like my hydrogenated superativa.
Helps with the accent. We can say anything. But what I wanted to say is, I think it's very interesting, and we're seeing this in a few places now. First of all, obviously, you've got this smaller indication with the prospect of a bigger indication. In this case, it's not going to be first in class. You're speaking to a best in class strategy. I would imagine that there's room in that market for both. And what I wanted to highlight here is that in this field, which is effectively cardiovascular, I mean, it's still these, we talk a lot about other diseases, but cardiovascular is still a massive still killer. Huge. And it's still huge. There's probably room for both. And there's still tremendous innovation. In fact, maybe even renewed innovation going in this place, enabled perhaps by genomics and causal biology. And so it seems to me that Arrowhead, despite its long journey, is actually riding the crest of the wave of those technology forces coming together, just its delivery plus the genomics. Is that a fair statement, Stephen?
I think that's right. And I mean, they're clearly cardiometabolic is kind of their primary focus, I think, initially. I think what's really interesting is then what comes after this. So Redemplo is kind of like this first step for them into the commercial phase, which in and of itself, I mean, if we look at, just take their, competitor Alnylam as a comparison, right? I mean, Alnylam went from being a $5 to $10 billion company to being a 40 plus, just a couple months ago, they were a $50 billion company. And all of that was built on one single TTR franchise. So you had one successful franchise and that got them there. And what you have with siRNA, right, is you have lots and lots of opportunities to build these sorts of franchises potentially. And so what I think is really sort of fascinating about Arrowhead is you have Redemplo as that kind of first step, but then they have a couple other cardio-focused programs that are going to be coming behind that. They have several obesity programs that kind of fit into a similar sort of space there for them, targeting inhibin and ALK7. ALK7 is interesting because that one is one of their first cases in which they've shown that they can deliver outside of the liver. That's targeted at adipose tissue, and they showed very good mRNA knockdown in adipose cells in their first phase 1 clinical trial earlier this year. And they're planning to do lots more of that. So that they're really targeting as one area of their growth future going forward is, can we get siRNA let's go beyond the liver. So can we go to adipose cells? Can we go to the brain? Can we go to the lung? Can we go to muscle? So there's lots of different areas that they think is going to be potential differentiator for them going forward. And then the other one I wanted to talk about was, so they have a dimer that's now entered the clinic. It targets PCSK9 and ApoC3. And that's, as far as I'm aware, it's the first instance of what's essentially a bispecific siRNA entering the clinic. And that's also something that Chris Anzalone said is going to be a big part of their future pipeline. We'll be looking at dimers for other indications. He mentioned that there will probably be several dimers coming in obesity for them. He said the two that they have in obesity aren't going to be the last. And so I think it'll be really fascinating to see, how they go about picking which targets to do combinations with, but just to see, what sort of efficacy you can get sort of using that kind of construct. So
I have to give credit to, I guess, the CEO and the management team for this strategy. Really seems to be a very good strategy. You really have to be able to demonstrate executional capabilities so people will have confidence, because what they've got is a mix of new technology, a little bit of target innovation, a very clear strategy from going from one product to the next. And if they can demonstrate executionally that they can deliver on clinical trials and data, investors are going to go along for the ride. And so really, I don't know all the downsides, but there seems to be a lot of interesting and well thought out strategy in the company. So the wait might have been worth it for them,
I think this is one of those blooming success stories where it's been a long winding road, but it looks like they're getting there.
Story. We love those. We love those on the pod, don't we? Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
All right. And they are sitting now at $8 billion in market cap.
Not too shabby.
Not too shabby. We'll see where they get to. Okay, maybe quickly, Stephen, Novartis spent $2 billion to buy an early stage oncology asset from Synnovation. And that's going to generate a return for the VC-backed company's shareholders, of course. Meanwhile, the startup's team of drug hunters will continue to advance the company's early stage pipeline. Kind of an interesting structure to the deal here. What thoughts do you have?
Yeah, no, you're right, Jeff. I mean, it very much, when we saw this deal, very harkened back to kind of the Nimbus-like kind of structure where you have this overhead of drug hunters who look for things and you develop them, and then you get to the point where you can then kind of hive it off for a profit that goes back to your investors, and just think is a very interesting sort of way to structure a company. And it looks very much like what Synnovation is doing here. And this is specifically in the PI3 kinase space where, historically there's been lots of issues around side effects for some of the early programs in this class. But, more recently, like last year, we saw Lilly buy a molecule from Scorpion for $2.5 billion that is taking a similar approach, and that you're looking to, go after the mutant sort of version of PI3K to try and reduce some of the side effect profiles. So interesting play here, and obviously a great deal for Synnovation's investors for sure.
Yeah, so Third Rock led the company's, I think, $102 million Series A round in 2024. Third Rock was joined in the syndicate by Nextech, Lilly Asia Ventures, Sirona Capital, and Cormorant. And the CEO, Yao, is telling us that Synnovation is likely to raise money again. So another one we'll be keeping our eye on. All right, let's take a quick break, and we'll get to a little discussion on AI.
BioCentury this week is brought to you by the 26th Bioequity Europe in Prague, Czech Republic. Innovators everywhere are seeing speed as the driver of investment, partnering and success, speed to the clinic, speed to early human data, speed to de-risk assets. The question for European biotechs is clear. How do you compete in this arena? Facing new momentum from Asia and an unpredictable landscape in the US, the science in Europe is there. There are more experienced operators. And investor sentiment finally is turning. What's needed now is speed. In its 26th edition, Bioequity Europe travels to Central and Eastern Europe for the first time to explore emerging opportunities in the region and debate how European biotech can accelerate to compete and lead in today's world. Join us in Prague, May 4th to 6th for this destination event for investors and biopharma leaders. Register at bioequityeurope.com. Bioequity Europe, where Europe accelerates to compete.
Okay, Lindsay, you worked on a story recently on AI and venture firms. Why was now the time to write this story for you?
That's right, Jeff. Yeah, I think the sentiment has largely shifted so that firms now are really trusting and adopting the use of AI into their workflows. So a year and a half ago, the trust was not really there. And now AI is being used across the entire venture funnel. And so now we're looking at, where is it being used and what are the use cases that are really most important for biotech venture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that globally, actually, adoption of AI has gone up. We've obviously been watching it for a while at BioCentury. So, I'm going to imagine that for VCs, they're sort of going along with that general drift. And I think people are still a little bit cautious about it, Lindsay, but maybe they know how to manage the risks a little bit better in terms of what are the data they put in. And, I'm just going to say that we know that AI has really arrived when our colleague Steve Usden is creating graphics on the fly of all kinds of interesting things with cartoons.
So besides the cartoons, so here's my question, and I think it's something you alluded to in the story, which is AI and venture, is it leading to firms making better decisions or different decisions than they would have without it, or simply getting to where they would have anyway quicker?
Right. I think that's a great question, Steve. So it really depends to what extent the firm is integrating the use of AI. So in some cases, firms are using AI to not just accelerate the pace of their work, but to identify missing information and potentially unlock new investment opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise identified. So in that case, it could be augmenting the workflow to identify new things. And then other firms have noted that AI doesn't necessarily change investment decisions, it's just accelerating the process.
Can you walk through a couple of the kind of either the agents or the kinds of things they're doing that feed into, those outputs that you just said?
Yeah, so really AI is being used from both the beginning of the funnel, so things like competitive landscaping, market mapping, down to the very bottom after the check has been written in things like portfolio support. So at the beginning, AI is being used for screening of inbound non-confidential pitch decks. So for example, Sofanova Partners is really the only firm that we spoke with that is using AI to assess and process their inbound non-confidential pitch decks. So they're using it to understand what companies are coming into the funnel, what do those programs look like, and then they can also triage and rank those programs to help identify what they should prioritize for future decision making, and then also identify hidden gems and research partners for the potential companies that they're investing in. And a second example can be things like using multi-agent systems to deliberate among simulated experts. So for example, Deerfield Management, we spoke with Mark Michalski, and he told us that Deerfield Management has multi-agent systems that can deliberate, say, among a pathologist and an oncologist, or a market access professional and an epidemiologist to help identify market pricing or what the population looks like for a disease indication. Towards the bottom of the funnel, another example could be identifying discontinued programs for portfolio companies. So we spoke with David Yang at Lux Capital, and he told us that that's an example of how they're using AI to help portfolio companies identify programs that have been discontinued by pharmas or biotechs that could potentially be taken up into development.
And let's just plug here that you don't have to create your own AI, because BioCentury's BCIQ database has now just added discontinued products. So you can use that to find them if you don't want to go build your own whole AI.
That's right. And it was interesting too, because in terms of competitive landscaping and market mapping, some of the firms noted that, they are using AI to help with competitive landscaping. And that really is cutting down on the time that those processes take, right? These are massive undertakings that maybe once took 600 hours and now can be cut down to a much more manageable, maybe 60 hours. But one of the limitations that the firms noted that we spoke with was that it really maybe can't get at the in-depth competitive landscaping and may miss some key insights.
Look, as we talked about at the beginning of the call with presenting companies at BioEquity Europe, the work only goes so far. Still meeting people face to face is a big part of it. And I just want to bridge from there to another face to face, where our colleague Selena Koch did a really great in-depth interview with Najat Khan, who's the CEO of Recursion, and very interesting take on how AI is being used in biotechs in drug development, and strongly encourage you to take a listen to that, because it's really not only about how Recursion's thinking about it, but more broadly, what are the issues that are playing out? It's a conversation that we have over time as we look at AI. And, in the same way as you said, we're not where we were a year and a half ago for VCs, nor is that true. Biotechs are also increasing and getting more sophisticated in the way they're adopting it.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's on our sister podcast, the BioCentury Show. You can listen to that wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, you name it. Lindsay, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think now is really the time. So the pace of AI is rapidly advancing. And interestingly, Deerfield's Michalski told us that, even if AI stopped advancing at this very moment, it would take another 12 to 24 months just to catch up to where we are now in terms of AI, to create living representations of our world around us. So I think, the firms that are integrating AI and seizing the moment are really going to be able to utilize that to their advantage.
Excellent. And Najat told Selena that AI will be judged by the medicines that it makes. So let's see what it makes. Okay, Steve, there was quite the demonstration at FDA last week by a group of ultra-rare disease advocates and no doubt patients. What's the backstory there?
Yeah, there was they had what they called a mock funeral in front of FDA. It was patients and family members and advocates, 109 of them, who are affected by a very rare disease, or actually a set of diseases called MPS. And they're immensely frustrated by the lack of regulatory progress, by regulatory setbacks at FDA. I've been following MPS and the efforts to move therapies from the lab into the clinic and from the clinic into commercial use for years now. The patients thought 2 years ago that they had a clear path from products that are in hand now, investigational products, to approvals, and that path ran through a biomarker, heparan sulfate, measured in the cerebrospinal fluid. And it's not working out the way that they believe that it should. They believe that the products that are, some of them that have been that have received setbacks, some of them that are coming up for approval decisions in the very near future, are basically their last hope, because they can't wait another 10 years for new therapies. They don't think that anybody's going to invest in new therapies if FDA is not approving therapies based on the biomarkers. And their kids are progressing rapidly, and nothing that's being developed has the potential to reverse progression. They only can slow or stop progression. So they're quite desperate, and they're quite upset. And they brought their case to FDA. They also brought their case to Capitol Hill.
Okay, and well, Steve, where are we with Prasad leaving, finding a replacement for CBER director?
And this is interesting because they, of course, the patient advocates, they directed some of their ire toward Vinay Prasad, the current director of CBER. This is really interesting. So when Prasad was picked, when previous CBER and CDER directors have been picked over the last year, there have been 5, by the way, CBER directors and 5 CDER directors over the last year at FDA, a year and a few months. In all of those cases, there were processes that were handled in a really opaque manner. it isn't really clear how the decisions were made and how wide the net was cast. It's being done differently now for CBER. I attribute this to, what I've written about, which is the kind of new chain of command that HHS has set up, where Chris Klomp is now the advisor to the counselor to the HHS secretary and seems to be playing an extraordinarily active role in day-to-day decision-making at public health agencies. So instead of just kind of picking somebody, FDA has put out a formal solicitation for a new CBER director. They've emphasized in the solicitation that they want somebody who has policy leadership experience, who can testify before Congress, who is capable of cross-agency coordination and of dealing with regulators overseas. There's explicit reference to emerging technologies in the solicitation. And all of that actually, I think, bodes well. It remains to be seen who they're going to pick, but they're certainly going to uncover a lot of really interesting and talented people through the process. The question is going to be whether somebody who's really qualified and who would be good at doing the job would be willing to work under the constraints that they would experience in the current administration. I should also say that it's also uncovered some kind of silliness. Martin Shkreli was on X over the weekend saying he'd be glad to take the job.
Ah,
so
haven't heard that name in a little while, Steve.
Yeah. I guess he wanted to be relevant again.
In addition to the turmoil at FDA and the changeover in leadership, another topic we've been watching quite closely here, Steve has been watching quite closely here, is most favored nation, the Trump administration drug pricing policy. Steve, what's the latest?
So I haven't written about this yet, but there's a lot of activity in Washington that's happening behind closed doors on MFN. The Trump administration's pushing really hard for codification of MFN, and industry's pushing back. So last week, 4 large pharmas were invited to the White House. They were shown a 90-page MFN bill, and they were asked to endorse it. And even though each of those companies have done so-called MFN deals with the Trump administration, they declined. The Trump administration wants MFN attached to a must-pass bill, but the opportunities for doing that are really few and far between. There's talk of a reconciliation bill ahead of the midterms. This is going to be extremely difficult for Republicans to pull off, given their slim majority in the House. There's also talk about attaching MFN to other budget legislation, also really difficult. But that doesn't mean the issue is going away. The industry is gearing up to launch legal attacks on CMS's MFN demonstration models. Lawyers who I've spoken with are quite confident that they'll be able to get an injunction. They're just waiting for the right timing from a legal perspective to file a suit. I would add that lawyers are always confident that they're going to win their cases. We'll see when the rubber hits the road on this.
Well, that said, the Trump administration's record in defending some of its policy has not been the best.
Well,
So-
there's precedent because in the first Trump administration, companies challenged a similar but different MFN rule, and they managed to have it knocked out by the courts. In that case, it was on procedural grounds rather than the more substantive grounds that they would be going after this one.
All right. Well, sounds good. Thanks for the update, Steve. And that's it for this week's BioCentury This Week podcast. We will be back next week. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to subscribe to this BioCentury podcast. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury This Week. KSO connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.